The world can be a stressful place. We picked this project as master students with full time jobs in order to release our energy and a way to calm our bodies every single day. Little did we know that the world would become even more stressful during this experiment with what is happening right now. Our experiment that we decided to focus on is the effects of video self evaluation on skill acquisition with yoga postures. And in our group, we have me, Maggie, Zyra, Gretel, Kelly, and Erin. Now, for the original study that we did, as you can tell on the slide and with the link underneath, was a study that evaluated the use of video, self-evaluation, and video feedback to increase the accuracy of yoga poses. There was 3 different yoga poses used. Were basically the basic yoga poses that you can do when you start learning how to do yoga. Multiple baseline design across behaviors with 2 adult participants in their 20s was used in the original study. The dependent variable was the percent correct on task analysis. So each of the yoga poses was divided into their own steps, and then the percent correct based on how you did during each session was evaluated. And then the independent variable was the video feedback intervention. So in baseline, you did not have any video feedback at all. Results showed that video self-evaluation increased the accuracy of 3 yoga poses selected. So between all the participants, everything increased in data. And additionally, video feedback increased the accuracy of 1 pose per 1 participant. So in all of the task analysis, all the steps basically increased, and they were able to attain their goal by the end of the experiment and gain lots of knowledge on yoga throughout the whole experiment.
All right, so now that we've talked about the original study, we're going to go in and talk about supporting literature for this study. In 2011, Woodier did a study about yoga, and he talked about how yoga has been around for about 3,000 years. It comes from the western part of the world. Also, yoga has been used to decrease many different mental health problems, such as anxiety, depression, stress, and other different mental health problems. In 2006, Mioni and Miranda did a study that explored the different uses of video modeling and the video feedback to teach different social interactions with children. Then moving along, Charlap, Christie, Lee, and Freeman also did a study that talked about video modeling will have the individual observe a videotape of a model engaging in a target behavior and subsequently imitating those behaviors. The video modeling has been used with a wide range of populations. So then getting into Akulian and Bellini in 2007, video modeling can be used for a wide range of teaching or self-reflection in the instance that we are doing in this study. Albert Bandura was able to show that by observing other people perform certain skills, those people will acquire that skill quicker.
After learning about the literature that we used, we decided to follow through with this experiment, and the purpose of this study for our experiment is to increase the accuracy of yoga poses through the use of video self-evaluation and video feedback. The primary goal was to increase yoga pose accuracy amongst 5 participants, with a secondary goal of being capable of correctly completing the final poses of tree pose, downward facing dog pose, and warrior 2 pose for more than 30 seconds.
Methods. For this replication, we perform 3 yoga poses: Vrksasana, tree pose; Drasana, 2, warrior pose; and Savannasana, downward facing dog pose. There are 5 female graduate student participants: Maggie G, 23 years old; Gretel G, 36 years old; Zyra C, 32 years old; Kelly S, age 24; and Erin K, age 27. All students attend Ball State University's online courses, where they all voluntarily signed up to be in a special education advanced applied behavior analysis class. None of the participants knew each other before the study, and none of them practicing yoga nor had prior experience with yoga. All lived in different places in the United States. Materials needed for the study are yoga mats or towels, video recording and internet accessible devices such as cell phones and laptops, stopwatch or timer, pencil or pen, calculator, and 3 task analysis recording forms, which I will talk about in the next couple of slides. Stopwatch or timer was used to record pose holds during the study. This was done by starting the timer every time a participant is in a specific position that requires 30-second holds, and ending the timer every time that participant is unable to keep the position. YouTube was used to demonstrate 3 yoga poses during baseline. If you want to check them out, here are the links. Participants measured the dependent variable skill acquisition with yoga postures using task analysis recording form to record the number of completed steps for each participant and for each pose. Because each yoga postures are different, the number of steps varied. For instance, Vriksasana tree pose had 8 steps. Virabhadrasana 2, Warrior 2 pose had 9 steps. And for Savanasana, downward facing dog pose, it required 5 steps to perform. Here is the operational definition of yoga. Yoga is defined as the act of physically moving one's own body using certain body parts defined within each pose. That is Vriksasana, Virabhadrasana 2, and Savanasana at home in an open space to attain the outcome of each specific pose. Within the study, 3 yoga poses were implemented: Vriksasana tree pose, Virabhadrasana 2, Warrior 2 pose, and Savanasana downward facing dog pose. The target behavior of each pose can be further described as the Vriksasana tree pose is a balancing pose in yoga in which one stands on one leg with arms raised. The Virabhadrasana 2, Warrior 2 pose, is a stretch pose in which one stands with legs and arms spread apart. Svanasana, downward facing dog pose, is a stretch pose in which one stands on the hands and feet. Data collection. Participants collected data once a day, 4 to 5 times per week from February 17th to April 1st at participants' respective homes. All participants were interested in improving their physical and mental well-beings. Multiple baseline design (MBL) across participants was used for this replication study. This design was used to measure participants' skill acquisition with yoga postures before and after intervention.
Moving to the next section of our replication study, during baseline, participants had the possibility to watch a YouTube video for each of the yoga poses. These YouTube videos serve the function of a yoga instructor that was available in the original study. Participants watched the video only one time during the first baseline session and imitated each yoga pose while recording the session. For the remaining baseline sessions, participants continue performing the poses and recording the sessions. Sessions were evaluated by the researchers using the task analysis that was created for each of the yoga poses. The results were shared via email. The baseline sessions were completed at each participant's home. Participants completed the yoga sessions independently. Participants had to collect baseline data for a minimum of 5 sessions or until data was stable. The duration of baseline sessions was approximately 10 minutes. Participants were requested not to practice yoga outside experimental conditions. Moving right along with the intervention section of our replication study, we utilize a multiple baseline design across behaviors to evaluate the effects of the intervention on the 3 yoga poses. In the first assessment session, intervention was implemented with the first yoga pose, while the other 2 poses remain in baseline condition. Researchers implemented the intervention to the subsequent yoga poses after a steady state or criterion level performance was observed in the previous pose. Yoga poses were attempted 1 time per session, and 4 to 5 assessment sessions were conducted per week. In the first intervention session, participants got familiar with the task analysis. In subsequent sessions, participants self-evaluated themselves following the steps on the task analysis. The primary intervention of this study is video self-evaluation. Participants viewed their poses on the recorded videos and self-evaluated themselves using the task analysis to score each of the steps in the pose. All sessions conducted during the intervention phase consisted of the participants scoring each video without assistance or feedback. The researcher planned for retraining if treatment integrity fell below 80%. The secondary intervention of this study is video feedback. Video feedback will only be implemented if the participants' pose performance show a low improvement level during the video self-evaluation phase.
Now let's talk about IOA. Each participant shared inter-observer agreement, IOA, and treatment integrity with other group members through email. All participants measured IOA by recording videos of themselves doing each pose, watching the videos, and evaluating the poses themselves as correct or incorrect for the same steps within the task analysis. Each participant sent video recordings from that day to their randomly selected partners via email. 2 partners watched the video recordings, scored observations using task analysis recording forms, and calculated the percent correct on task analyses by counting the number of correct steps, dividing it by the total number of steps in the task analysis, and multiplying the result by 100. Then each partner sends their task analysis recording forms back to the original participant, who will then calculate the IOA. The IOA was calculated using exact agreement IOA, in which both observers and the original participant all have to have the exact percent correct on task analyses. If they all have the same percent correct, they are all equal. If one or only 2 scores matched, they are not equal. To calculate this, count the number of sessions they are equal and divide it by the total number of sessions and multiply it by 100 to find the IOA percent. For tree pose, everyone's IOA ranged from 93 to 97%. For Warrior 2 pose, everyone's IOA ranged from 90 to 97%. For Downward Facing Dog pose, everyone's IOA ranged from 86 to 90%. Now let's talk about treatment integrity. Permanent product of all yoga poses were recorded via videos, which help with tracking of the exact data that needed to be recorded, as well as having 2 observers score each video recordings. This ensures the agreement of performance self-evaluation stays above 80%.
Jumping into my data, as you can tell, overall, all my data is on an increasing trend for all the yoga poses. Since I have not had any previous yoga experience and I'm not necessarily flexible, my data remained fairly low in the baseline phase for all of it. I was never able to master any of the yoga poses by the end of the intervention, unfortunately. For the first pose, the tree pose, I was in baseline for 6 sessions. This seemed to be the easiest of all the poses for me to grasp and have stable data in order to go into intervention. The data in baseline was in a low to medium level with a stable trend and little to no variability. Once in intervention, with self-evaluation of video monitoring, my data started going on an upward trend and was finally increasing. The data was in the medium to high level at this point and became stable towards the end of these sessions, and that is why I could go into maintenance by the 20th session. I average above 70% in maintenance, and as you can tell, there's little to no variability, even though I did decrease only by a little bit. For the second pose, downward dog, I had a harder time going into intervention. I was very variable in the first 5 sessions with no visible trend at all, but became stable in the second half of baseline. This intervention phase was the most variable of the 3, with an overall increasing trend that became stable in the last 4 sessions only. Fairly stable in the medium level in maintenance with data above 60% as well. I did not successfully master both the poses so far based on our 95% target goal. And for the last pose, the warrior pose, my data was extremely variable in the middle level in baseline. Due to this, it took me a relatively longer time than the rest of the poses to go into intervention. Once in intervention, I did increase in data by over 40% accuracy in this pose, which I'm very proud of. Some variability still was visible in the data, and stability was harder to attain since it was harder to hold this pose for me for those 30 seconds. That was the requirement. In maintenance, my data slightly decreased and showed a downward trend. This was partially also due to the stress of the current world situation. Now we can talk about kind of my overall graph. As you can tell, I did increase overall. There was a lot of variability, but this is also because with yoga you do increase, but you also see days where you just can't hold that pose for 30 seconds or you forget a step, even with video monitoring of the YouTube videos that we had. For the first pose, the tree pose, in baseline, my average for the data was 34.4%, and there was a range of 12.5. Once in intervention, as you can tell, I did increase by over 40% at 73.1% with a range of 37.5. This kind of shows that the range also means variability, but it also means that I did increase in my data. And then once in maintenance, it only decreased by 2% for the average, and it was 71.9% with a range of 12.5. Once we head to the downward dog phase, in baseline, I was at 33.3% with a range of 20. As you can tell, this is very similar to where I started off with the tree pose, pretty much same percentage of accuracy through my task analysis. Once I went into intervention, I did increase again by 30% in this one, with 64.6% as the average and 40 as my range, since I did actually increase a lot into intervention with this pose. Once in maintenance, I actually stayed fairly similar with my data average at 64% and a range of 20. With the warrior pose, my baseline was the highest of all of them, but also I did notice the largest drop at the end. So in baseline, I was at 39.8% with a range of 11.1. Once in intervention, I did make a nice leap into 67.7% with a range of 22.2. And once in maintenance, I did drop an astonishing 5% with an average of 61.1. This can also be due to the fact that this pose did have the least amount of maintenance targets because I did jump into the intervention relatively late compared to the rest of them, and overall my study, I had 27 sessions. Our range was 25 to 30, but I couldn't attain all 30, which I think would have helped a little bit with my data in maintenance for the last pose. I also believe that due to everything happening in the world and already having to be locked inside my own house, I was not as motivated and didn't feel a need or want to perform the best I could, unfortunately. I do believe that mood is a big factor at being able to remain calm and focused during yoga, and since my mood was definitely not at all calm and focused and I was relatively stressed with everything happening, I wasn't able to relax my whole body and kind of zone in to be able to attain everything I wanted to with my data.
All right, so now that Maggie's talked about her graphs, I'm going to go into my graphs. Overall, I stayed pretty consistent throughout the whole thing. I knew a little bit about yoga, but I definitely don't have any type of flexibility or balance when it comes to yoga. I was unable to master any of my poses during this time because I could not keep my balance for the life of me. During the first pose, which was the tree pose, I was in baseline for 5 sessions. I was able to understand the pose fairly quickly, but I just could not keep my balance. After baseline, it really wasn't showing any variability, so I went into intervention with the video recordings. Over time, I did see an increase, but my data was pretty consistent during the last 5 days, so then I was able to go into maintenance, where I had a little bit more variability. For my tree pose, during baseline, I had an average of 60% that ranged from about 50% to 83%. During intervention, I had a 78% average, which ranged from 63% to 88%. And then for maintenance, I had an average of 79%, which ranged from 75% to 88%. So overall, I did have an upward trend. For the second pose, which was downward dog, I was not able to go into intervention as quickly as I would like because I had very different data throughout intervention. It pretty much stayed consistent between 20 and 40% through the entire time. So then once it finally became consistent, I was able to go into intervention. Then during intervention, overall, I was pretty all over the place. Then I hit a plateau before getting some higher scores. After the data became more steady, I was able to enter maintenance. And then during maintenance, I was completely steady throughout, but at the end of the day, I was not able to master that pose. For baseline, I had an average of 34% with a range between 20 and 40%. In intervention, 58% with an average of 20% to 80%, which is a huge range. For maintenance, I had an average of 60%, and I stayed consistent with 60% during that time. For the last pose, which is the warrior pose, my data was pretty steady. Then I had a dip in the middle of baseline before it went back up. During this, it did take me a lot longer to get into intervention because of that. It was kind of steady, then it dipped, then it went back up. Basically, this whole time I had average scores kind of in the middle, and I just did not find myself doing any better. But then for the majority of it, it was pretty steady. For baseline, I had an average of 52% with a range of 44% and 56%. And for intervention, I had a mean of 56% with an average of 44 to 66%. And then for maintenance, I had an average of 63% and a range of 56 to 66%. Throughout this whole process, when taking data, I definitely lost motivation during this because of everything that's going on in the world. With the whole world being in crisis due to COVID-19, we had to shut everything down. I've had to stay in my house. I've had to work from home. So there definitely was not as much motivation to really focus on my video recordings to see what I was doing wrong, what I was doing right. And so that was kind of hard to do during this time. But overall, I stayed pretty consistent. I didn't really decrease anything, and I did have an upward trend throughout all of it. So I'm kind of impressed with how I did throughout the intervention.
Gretel's graph shows the effects of video self-evaluation on 3 yoga poses. It is a multiple baseline design across behaviors where the intervention was introduced in a time lag fashion across the behaviors. Each data path represents a yoga pose. For the first 2 poses, baseline shows a moderate level variability with a decreasing trend. In the last baseline phase, we can observe a high level variability with no meaningful trend. When intervention was first implemented for the first 2 intervention phases, immediate changes in trend and level were observed. Data patterns presented a high level variable data with an increasing trend. Intervention phase in the last yoga pose presented a high level variability with no meaningful trend. It would have been beneficial to have more data in this phase to verify the evolution of the data pattern. The first 2 sections of the design are 2 demonstrations of the effects of video self-evaluation in increasing and improving the performance and skill acquisition of each yoga pose. In the last section of the design, experimental control cannot be established because of the highly variable data. A functional relationship cannot be identified since the minimum number of replications of the effects of the intervention in the target behavior was not achieved. I have to say that this is my first time practicing yoga. I think there were some confounding variables affecting my overall performance of the 3 yoga poses.
I'm Erin, and I'm going to be discussing my data and graph for this study. I had never done yoga before. At the beginning, my baseline was relatively low for most of the poses. As I continued, I found out I kind of have a knack for it. My intervention with the self-evaluation, I really was able to get a lot of the steps on the task analyses right. But as you can see in my graphs, especially for the tree pose with the intervention, it is on a upward trend, and by the end, by maintenance, I did get to 100% on the task analyses, and in maintenance, I basically stayed where my intervention was. And on the downward dog pose, going from towards the bottom on baseline, getting towards the top with self-evaluation, able to see which steps I was not able to get. And then at the end as well, I was able to get to 100%. And then in maintenance, again, I stayed relatively where my intervention was. And at the end of the last sessions for both the tree pose and downward dog. I got to 100% as well in maintenance. And for the last pose, the warrior pose, my baseline was a little bit higher. The starting positions weren't as difficult to try to get to in the baseline. So as you can see, my baseline's more of a medium level. And then with the intervention as well, being able to see myself and evaluate in the intervention phase, I was able to, again, go on that upward trend, able to get more correct. But I did not, at the end of the intervention phase, get to 100% on the warrior pose. However, in maintenance, I stayed right where the intervention left off, and then having practiced it through the intervention at the end of maintenance on my last session, I got to 100%. With looking back with just how this time has been kind of crazy with the COVID-19, and we were going to do it in the home, our yoga poses, but just with the extra stress and just things going on, it was somewhat difficult to try to get all of these sessions in on a daily basis, about 45 times a week. But since I felt like I was getting the yoga poses, I was kind of more excited to do them each day and see if I could get to 100%.
Here's my graph in the picture of my dog performing Savasana, downward facing dog pose. Visual analysis of my data showed that in downward facing dog pose, the baseline level was low, the trend was gradually increasing, variability was also low. I chose to go to intervention early on because first, I had enough data points, and second, the last few data points were stable. For the intervention, the level was medium to high, the trend was increasing, variability was highly variable. I chose to end the intervention because the last few data points seemed stable. Maintenance, the level was medium to high, trend was gradually decreasing, variability was moderately variable. For the tree pose, baseline level was medium, the trend was gradually increasing, variability was low. I chose to go to intervention after 8 sessions. Intervention with video self-evaluation. The level was medium to high, the trend was gradually increasing, variability was moderately variable. The level on maintenance was medium, the trend was gradually decreasing, and the variability was variable. For the Warrior 2 pose, the baseline level was medium, the trend was gradually increasing, variability was low. I chose to go to intervention after 13 sessions because, again, I did have more than enough data points. And second, there was little to low variability. Then intervention with video self-evaluation. The level there was high, trend was gradually increasing, variability was also low. I chose to go to intervention because first, I had enough data points, and second, there was a gradual increase, and then it stabilized. Maintenance level was medium, trend was gradually decreasing, variability moderately variable. So overall, there was an increasing trend for all yoga poses. The baseline face level was low to medium since I've never done yoga before. Once video self-evaluation was implemented during intervention phase, I gradually got better, but I never reached 100% and was unable to master any of the yoga poses by the end of intervention. I did not think I would be able to do 29 sessions, but since we are all in quarantine, practicing these poses was surprisingly helpful. It kept me somewhat moving, gave me some flexibility and a peace of mind, especially during this unprecedented time.
As a group, our members showed an increase in the percent correct of the yoga pose steps and the task analysis. The intervention yielded, for each individual, we saw an upward trend and an increase in our abilities, and maintenance stayed above our baseline scores, relatively around where our intervention scores were. We used a multiple baseline design, although each member did differ slightly between the poses and the length of the baseline and intervention phases. Overall, the self-evaluation intervention did show promising results for increasing the behavior of correctly performing the steps of several different yoga poses across all of us group members, and we all had no prior experience with doing yoga. So we did see an increase and promising results for the study replication using the video self-evaluation.
In this section, I will mention the main limitations that we face while conducting the study replication. The setting of the original study was a fitness lab. A replication was conducted in the home setting. The original study was composed by 2 male students. A replication was composed by 5 female students. Participants from the original study attempted each yoga pose 2 to 3 times during each assessment session. 3 assessment sessions were conducted per meeting, and 2 to 3 meetings per week. In a replication, we could only perform 1 attempt of each yoga pose per assessment session, 1 session per meeting, and 4 to 5 meetings per week. In the original study, the researcher acted as a model in the first 2 baseline sessions, serving as an instructor in a standard yoga instruction session. In the study replication, participants had to use YouTube videos for each yoga pose to serve the function of the modeling instructor. The original study had 2 independent observers, blind to the experimental conditions, who recorded 33% of the video recording sessions. We had to calculate IOA by assigning 2 participants to record data on a third participant's performance of yoga poses using the already recorded video sessions. This may have impacted negatively our replications if the participants recording IOA were familiar with the process. For our study replication, we created our task analysis and did not have any certified yoga instructor who revised it. In the original study, they have a certified yoga instructor who reviewed the task analysis.
In conclusion, our study replication overall as a group, it went well, and we saw the intervention work as we all saw increasing scores throughout this intervention. However, with the limitations stated earlier, considering the differences from the original study that we had, and with the unforeseen circumstances of this pandemic and having to stay home, and with that increased stress, the study was not as easy to replicate, especially to a T with the original study. But given the limitations for another replication to happen in the future, there should be more structure and more adherence to the original study to see if the results will still show that upward trend and the experimental control of the intervention, that it is what is increasing the behavior and the ability to perform the steps of the yoga poses better throughout the intervention phase, with the video self-evaluation for each individual and the continuing maintenance showing that it stays at a relatively high percentage of correct. Thank you for watching our presentation. This was our study replication of yoga poses using self-evaluation to increase percent correct on a task analysis.